We'd like to begin with a quiz on Dr. Corelli's presentation. Would you all take out a pencil and paper, please? Thank you very much. A critical part of this profound disease is counseling. And where do you find help? We have two very, very impressive young men here, because they're both younger than I am, to talk from two perspectives. We bifurcated this in from a personal standpoint and a vocational standpoint. And some very, today, this morning, we're going to see some original research by one of our PhDs that does address the family issues. But I might add, for all of those who look at the title and say, what's next in your life? I'm sitting next to two PhDs who have the disease. PhDs who have the disease. You can accomplish anything. So right now I'd like to introduce Dr. Phil Remel from Kent State University. And Dr. Jonathan Dator from Seton Hall University, PhD. And I'd like to start with, well, Phil, we'll start with you about your background and your journey. Is that okay? Sure. We'll go then to Jonathan, who will present his research as well. Here you go, Phil.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, everyone. Lisa, thanks for having me here on this panel. Jonathan, glad to be sharing this time with you. When did you finish your dissertation?
1 month ago.
1 month ago. Would you join me in congratulating this young man on a tremendous accomplishment? He'll tell you a little bit more about that. He didn't get enough grilling at his dissertation defense, so he's going to share some of his findings for us, and we can ask a few more questions that they may have forgotten. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for your time and attention. Those of you who are affected with LHON and your families, I want to commend and congratulate all of you for the courage and persistence and tenacity that I know you have to marshal every day to get through what is a very difficult adjustment process. LHON can bring with it a really profound sense of loss, and at a minimum a need for really significant adjustment. But there's also, as you think about those things that that constitute loss, loss of your vision, and other things in your life, I think it's important to keep in mind all the things that are left. And if you start orienting yourself in that way, you may find there's quite a bit left, actually. We know that the onset of disability doesn't affect people's interests for the most part. It doesn't affect their passions and their values and those core aspects of who they really are. Often doesn't affect their personality. And people want to continue on doing many of the same things that they did before, perhaps in different ways. So I'm just glad to be a part of this. I'm not sure that my own story is all that interesting. It's not even that interesting to me sometimes, but I've been affected with LHON since I was 15. I was going into my senior year of high school. A few months earlier, I had, for the first time, been given a pair of reading glasses. I needed them to pass my the visual test for my learner's permit. I was taking driver's ed, and I was active in sports and student activities. My dad was a logger. I grew up in Vermont. I used to work with him in the woods, cutting firewood and things like that. And in June of 1984, I guess it was, I was playing on the school baseball team with my glasses for the first time. And by July of that year, when I turned 16, I could no longer read the headlines in newspapers. It had progressed that quickly, although I guess it had been coming on for some time. But it was over a fairly short period of time. Grew up on a dirt road in a small town in Vermont. As I said, I wanted to stay in the public school, and my public school guidance counselors and others put in a program for me so that I could stay with my friends. I talk about that, keeping things going the way that you had them, and for me that was really important. Stayed in a public school, continued on with my courses, kind of a college prep track I thought I was on, but I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen after high school. Everything really just kind of changed going into that last year of high school. I had a meeting with my school counselor, whose son was in my class and was a friend of mine. I'd known this gentleman for years, and I went to him with my mother, and it was months at this time. It took a long time to rule everything else out and determine that it was actually Leber's that was affecting me. So it was several months from the time my visual impairment onset to the time that they figured out what exactly I was dealing with. But I knew I couldn't see very well. And so I went and met with my counselor and said, I don't know what we're going to do, but I can't, I can't read. I can't play ball anymore. Football season was coming. I thought I couldn't do that. I can't drive my car. I'd already bought a car, getting my license. I can't do that. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go to college. What am I going to do? And he stopped me there, and he'd known me for a long time, and he said, you've taken about a half an hour telling me all the things you can't do, and he said, I understand this is new, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I haven't heard you say anything about the things you can do, still. And he said, and I remember this, just had a profound impact on me then, and he said, nobody's ever going to remember you for what you didn't do. And so that really kind of made me think, and right then, and we sort of changed the discussion about what things are left, what I wanted to accomplish, those kinds of things. So with his support and his help, I ended up going to a college, which was a different college than I probably would have gone to had this not happened. I chose the college because it was near my home. I was still going back and forth to the doctor in Boston to find out exactly what was happening. This school was well known for services for students with disabilities. Again, this is all totally new. So I went to college and enjoyed that very much. I enjoyed a break from the extended my adolescence and wanted to break from the real world. I liked it so much I decided to stay in school. I stayed and got a master's degree in counseling, and then went to the University of Arkansas where I completed a PhD in rehabilitation. I guess my interest in that field was driven by my experiences going through the process and as a rehabilitation consumer, thinking about all of the help and support, even at that early stage of my life, I'd received at that time. I became interested in it professionally. And Jonathan, I know that's probably part of what has drawn you to your work and certainly to your research. This happens. So from there, I took a faculty position at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, training rehabilitation counselors, and that's what I do now at Kent State. I've been there for 18 years. We train people at the master's degree level to provide employment and other counseling services to people with disabilities, not just blindness and low vision, but other disabilities as well. My own work, I do some work in blindness, but I do a lot of work in multiple sclerosis and disability issues in general. And I guess for me, the meaningful part of my own career has probably been my personal connection going through that process at a very vulnerable time in my life, and many of you can relate to that. The timing of this is lousy for the most part, particularly when you're still trying to find your way. But I think thanks to a lot of good help along the way, very strong family support. We're working, unsophisticated people who didn't bargain for any of the adjustment that goes on with this process. I told you I grew up on a dirt road, so transportation, no public transportation, anything like that, those kinds of issues. I was just at the very beginning of the computer age, so I had to learn to, type, and I've had to kind of roll with changes in technology as time has gone on. But thanks to a lot of help and a lot of support along the way, I have the really rare privilege of working in a field that has some personal meaning to me, and feeling like the things that I do can make a contribution to other people. I don't mean to be sanctimonious about that. I don't do a lot of consumer panels like this, and again, my own experience. I'd rather tell you about the work that I'm doing and things like that. That's kind of my angle, I think, for the most part. But it's been great, even in yesterday and today, to talk with other people who are dealing with this very issue, and I'm learning a lot about the process, and this can feed my teaching, as I'm training professionals who'll be working with you and your family members in moving forward and keeping things rolling. And learning things about out here in the exhibits about technology and things that can help me in my own life and that kind of thing. So it's a great opportunity for me to be here and share any perspective I can with you. But this guy's a lot more interesting than I am, so I'm going to turn it over to him. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's definitely not the case. We're all equally interesting. You know, I guess the first thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to ask people here, and you can just shout this out, obviously, just a couple of people, without thinking about it. What's the first thing you think of when you hear disability?
Wheelchairs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Unemployment.
Stigmas.
Yes.
Old age.
Hmm. Yeah, so those are some fantastic examples, you know, and when that first pops out in my head, that's really the first thing that I think of too, is lesser than or unable. And I think the word itself sort of brings up a lot of things, brings up images in our head, and it brings up, you know, maybe ideas of what we thought that was before we developed LHON. And I know that was the case for me. My case of being diagnosed is a little bit different. I went to a local eye doctor, and he said, I think you have LHON, but I'm not qualified to tell you that. And he said, so I think you should go to New York City, because I was living in Connecticut at the time. That's where I grew up. He said, you know, you could see a specialist down there that specializes in neuro-ophthalmology, and they will be able to confirm it. I really can't tell you for sure. I had no idea what it was. It was shocking. I didn't really believe it. And so I go down to this neuro-ophthalmologist in New York City who says to me, listen, don't ask about laser surgery. Don't ask about a cure. There isn't one. This is what you have. We'll do the DNA test, but in about 7 weeks, it'll be confirmed. And you're just going to have to live with it. There's no cure, maybe in 20 or 30 years, but even then, I don't really think so. And it was one of those moments of just feeling completely devastated, as though there was just no hope, and oh my God, I am never going to have a job. I'm going to have to drop out of college. I was a sophomore in college at the time, 20 years old. This was in April of 2003. Never going to have a love life, never going to have kids, and those were the thoughts that were rushing in my mind as this medical doctor was telling me, you know, don't ask about anything. There's nothing we can do. And that's just the worst thing you can hear. And you know, I think I've dedicated my career since then to realizing one thing, which is we need to be better than that. As professionals, when we talk to our patients. And so that's one of my biggest goals as a psychologist moving forward, is to make sure that I educate other professionals about the language that we use and the way we talk to our patients, because people can't hear that. It's almost not acceptable. It isn't acceptable. And so this is going to be a very quick and dirty, because it's going to be fast, talk about some of the research that I've done over the last couple of years. You know, after going through college and dealing with some adversity and the adjustment process to LHON, I graduated with a degree in psychology from Western Connecticut State University. And I realized, as most bachelor's degree recipients in psychology realize, you kind of have to go further to do anything with that. And so I pursued a master's degree in counseling at Boston University and realized that I was really passionate about research and disability work and how all of this integrates together with the clinical work that I was doing, working with children and then eventually college students. And so, you know, I decided to move on to a PhD program, and I was accepted into Seton Hall University, which I'm very grateful for my experience there because I had a mentor who said, "You want to do research on LHON? I don't really know what that is, but go for it." And so she was very open about, you know, letting me try this. And I'm lucky to be from a pretty diverse research lab where people were interested in what it was about and, you know, where my research could go. So I'm going to present quickly on that, talk about 2 studies that I've done over the last 3 years on the psychological impact of LHON. And obviously, if anyone wants some of these slides afterwards, I can email them. I can email some of the results of the studies to anyone who's interested, can talk over lunch in more detail, because this might be a little bit briefer than is possible to get into all the nuts and bolts of what went on in both of these studies. So what got me interested was realizing, you know, that it's great that so many people are here, but we are a pretty small community because genetic diseases are so rare. In this introduction slide right here, it's stating that there's about 4,000 known genetic diseases, and there's new ones discovered every year. And that's something that's pretty emotional for me in thinking about is, who's going to be here next year that might have a child or might themselves become affected within the next year that isn't right now? Or who would not have been sitting here last year that's had someone in their life affected within the last year? So there's new one discovered every year. They're developing in individuals every year. And genetic diseases are extremely rare, affecting 1 in thousands and millions of people worldwide. There's a description of LHON. We all know what that is, so we can skip through that. And you know, I think the biggest thing here was why I got interested in looking at the psychological impact was talking to so many people over the phone or online and realizing that this is a really tough adjustment process and that it feels like you're alone, but you're really not. We're all sort of going through that process. And let's look at some data and figure out what that's about and what's going on for people that are dealing with that. And so, you know, a lot of the language used in social science research are terms like temporarily able-bodied, right? So we're all temporarily able-bodied. At some point in our lives, we might become disabled with something, whether it's an older age or in young adulthood or as children. And with that can come something called learned helplessness, which is this idea of others trying to do everything for you because they're trying to help, but sometimes that can cause you to not believe that you can have that independence anymore. And so I really think that's important moving forward in terms of looking at LHON research, but any research, because individuals with disabilities right now make up 22% of the United States population. It is the largest minority group in the country, and it's rarely discussed as a diversity variable. And so these conversations need to happen. So the next slide is about, it's actually a poster that I did at the American Psychological Association in 2012 in Orlando, Florida. This poster won Best Student Poster Presentation. I was really proud of that because I was really excited to see that so many psychologists cared enough about this. Basically, what I looked at here in this poster board presentation was my second year project at Seton Hall, which I decided to look at how individuals with LHON cope. And so this study had 86 people fill out an online survey, all of whom had lost their vision due to LHON. 62 that filled it out were male and 24 were female, sort of aligns with some of the averages that we talk about. This study in particular was pretty much male-dominated, and pretty much dominated in terms of individuals being white or Caucasian, which is interesting because typically with LHON it does not discriminate. So that might skew this sample a little bit. But I thought what was interesting about this was that I had individuals fill out 2 surveys. One was the impact of vision impairment questionnaire, and it looked at how a vision impairment impacts someone from multiple domains. The most important one for this study being the emotional impact. And then I decided to look at a protective factor that's been found throughout the literature with other disabilities to be beneficial, which is social support. So is there a correlation? Is there a nice connection there between individuals that get more social support from their family, friends, or a significant other and their ability to cope better emotionally with the diagnosis of LHON using their scores on the impact of vision impairment questionnaire? So the results, interesting enough, were sort of mixed in terms of not really finding social support to be a strong protective factor for dealing with LHON with issues like leisure or work and career decision making. But the biggest impact for this population was the emotional subscale of the impact of vision impairment questionnaire, which is sort of the one I was most hoping to find anyway. And overall scores on a multiple scale of social support and the impact of vision impairment questionnaire were aligned. And so looking at social support from family, friends, and a significant other and combining that all together found it to be that individuals with higher scores on that coped better with LHON. And I think this makes sense based on everything that we've heard so far this morning from the journey of LHON, which is that having a significant other that is really there for you. I know that was really important for me. Having parents that will show up at conferences like this one and do anything they can. Sit there and try out that eyewear and see if it's worth buying, or getting up and speaking at this conference. I mean, that type of support goes a long way, and it's noticed, even if sometimes through frustration from the individual that's affected, it might not seem like it's getting noticed. It is. And friend group, very important, especially with LHON, where the classic case of LHON happens in young adulthood. That's when people are sort of figuring out who they are and developing a friend group, or already having a pretty strong one in place. And so it makes sense that that would be a pretty strong protective factor in how individuals cope with LHON too, because that's a strong sense of support, and one that's sort of related to their own age group, which I think is really important during this time of life. And so that was a second-year project, pretty small-scale study, but the results, I think, were pretty interesting and sort of along what was expected. The next slide is just the topic of the next study that I did, which was done over the last year, and this was sort of the big one, which is my dissertation. I found, pretty significant results with individuals who were affected by LHON, but I kind of wanted to look at those who were unaffected. So for my second-year project, I looked at the impact of genetic disease on the family members. So examining the relationship between levels of psychological well-being, using a questionnaire that looks at psychological distress, interpersonal problems, and social role dysfunction, and more protective factors and how those help. So again, I wanted to look at the protective factor of perceived social support, because that was beneficial for individuals that had lost their vision. And I sort of made the assumption and the hypothesis that it would be beneficial for mothers and siblings as well. And also looked at spirituality, because in most of the literature that's available, while there's no literature on psychological impact of LHON, sort of broaden that out to literature on disability in general and other genetic diseases. And spirituality and religion seem to be very helpful in coping with those conditions. And so I wanted to see if that would be the same case with this population. Next up, this is sort of the statement of the problem and the decision to go forward with this study, which just sort of what I talked about. Most of the literature has anything to do with LHON, but in addition, it's mostly focused on the individual that has a disability. So not much research on family members at all on any disability. There's just not much disability literature out there. And Dr. Nancy Newman down at Emory University, who's one of the top neuro-ophthalmologists and has done a lot of research over the last few decades, said that anecdotally, there's no data behind this, but said that psychological stress in a 2009 article could have an impact on individuals getting LHON. So perhaps someone that's been unaffected, psychological stress could cause them to become affected. And dealing with high levels of stress could become a protective factor in realizing, well, let's get someone to calm that anxiety down if they don't have vision loss yet, because we've seen in other diseases, especially autoimmune diseases, and I know LH1 is not one of those, but that's where some of the strongest data lies, that psychological stress can trigger various diseases to become onset. And so that's something important to look at from a place of a protective factor. And again, I think this is important for this research because there is none on LHON. And so I think this is sort of groundbreaking in terms of it being the first. And I think it's long overdue. So The study that I did, the design of it was causal comparative, which means that I'm looking at, with this study, how mothers and siblings' levels of psychological well-being compared to the general overall population of people that completed the same survey, which is called the Outcome Questionnaire 45, a survey that's been tested and is reliable and valid through various tests before and different studies. And so comparing that is that part of it. The other part is correlational, which means I ran some regressions with my statistics and just looked at how social support and spirituality impacted individuals who were affected and if that increased their levels of psychological well-being or whether it had no impact at all. So to quickly go over some of these results. Right off the bat, just some demographic information. 117 people completed the survey. This was actually just over the last few months. Some of you sitting here might have completed the survey. Of that group, 65 were mothers and 52 were siblings. It looks sort of glaring that 100 of them would be female, but that just makes sense, right? Because most of them that completed the survey were mothers, and it's more likely that unaffected siblings would be female. So it is sort of a high number there, but I think that makes sense. 17 were male. 104 of the respondents, similarly to the second-year project I did on individuals who were affected, were white, so it was mostly a white or Caucasian sample. 10 were Latino or Hispanic, 2 identified as Asian, and 1 self-identified as Black or African American. So once again, in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, not much of that in this sample. I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. And interestingly enough, most were married between the 45 and 55-year-old age range, and most of the participants had children. So moving forward. So there were 6 hypotheses in this study. The first hypothesis, which I had talked about, which was that individuals who have a child who's been affected by LHON-related vision loss, my hypothesis was that they would have higher levels of psychological distress, social role dysfunction, and interpersonal problems than a normative sample, so the general population. This hypothesis was partially supported, and I had some interesting results with this one. So mothers of someone with LHON have higher levels of psychological distress than the overall general population. Makes sense, right? This is very hard to deal with. It's very hard to deal with when it's your own child. It could be very scary. There could be some feelings of guilt, some feelings of depression, really hard things to deal with that are not often talked about and are sometimes taboo. So it makes sense why those scores were higher. Interpersonal problems, that was not an issue. That was not statistically significant. And looking back on it now, I think that makes sense. I think most mothers are sort of in a phase of life where they're comfortable with who they are and where they stand. And so I think for that reason, that was not an issue. What was sort of an opposite than what was expected was social role was actually increasingly higher than the average population, which means that they felt more confident in their social role in the family. And I think that makes a lot of sense too, why that would be an opposite result than what I was expecting in the hypothesis, because a lot of mothers might feel like, let's kick it into gear. I am now going to take on that caretaker role more than ever. Really need to take care of my child here, whether it's coming to conferences or looking up every possible fact or information I can find about LHON or how to get my son or daughter through college or any type of assistance I can provide them. That role within the family is maybe more heightened than it was before the LHON onset. And so that makes a lot of sense too when we look at the results here. The second hypothesis, this will be pretty quick because nothing was statistically significant. In terms of spirituality, it was not correlated as a protective factor for mothers. In other words, mothers' scores and levels of psychological well-being were not improved once levels of spirituality and religion increased. So that wasn't seem to be any connection there, which is sort of interesting to me because in other research with disability there is a lot of that. So there could be a lot of reasons for that, just including the questionnaire that I used. I think that's why future studies might still want to look at this as a variable that's a protective factor. Third hypothesis for my dissertation study was that perceived levels of social support for mothers would increase their psychological well-being and ability to cope and adjust. that was partially supported. And in particular, as I had talked about with individuals who were affected, there being social support from friends, a significant other, or a family member. The area here that was statistically significant was social support from a family member really seemed to increase mothers' levels of psychological well-being. So really having that support from your family, whether it's a spouse or other children in the home, or perhaps the extended family really taking on a significant role, seems like a collaboration and a connection within the family really seems to help mothers of someone affected with LHON vision loss significantly. Next is the fourth hypothesis. So we're no longer looking at mothers. Now this is siblings for the final three hypotheses. This was the most statistically significant of anything here, and I thought this was really interesting, was that siblings really seem to be struggling the most, at least according to this study. So the fourth hypothesis, similar to the first one with mothers, looked at whether or not siblings' levels of psychological well-being, which were defined by psychological distress, interpersonal problems, or social role dysfunction, would be higher than that of the general population, a normative sample. Everything here was statistically significant, so it showed that siblings struggled more and had more interpersonal problems, social role dysfunction, and interpersonal problems and psychological distress levels than the normative sample. For anyone that's interested in statistics in the room, these were all significant at the 0.01 and 0.001 level, which is pretty much the most significant results can get. And I think this is really important because when we look at siblings, there's a lot of factors going on here. There's sort of that fear of, could this now happen to me? Or we now know this is in our family. This is kind of scary. And what does my role become in the family now that my brother or sister is affected? And so when we talk about psychological stress possibly being a trigger, and again, this is just anecdotal, there's no evidence behind that per se yet, I think that's important to look at, is that psychological distress levels are extremely high in siblings who are unaffected and have yet to lose their vision, and that's something that we want to monitor and be aware of. Next up is levels of spirituality in siblings. Very similar to the mothers, nothing here was statistically significant. So the hypothesis was rejected, that individuals with higher levels of spirituality would have improved levels of psychological distress, interpersonal role, and social role dysfunction. None of that ended up being statistically significant. And again, this could be due to the measure, and in future studies it would be interesting to continue to look at this variable. The final thing here is the sixth hypothesis, which looked at perceived social support. Similarly to with mothers, this too found that the family variable was the most significant. So really getting that support from your family. And I think that's really important for siblings who are unaffected, because I know in my family, when I lost my vision, there was this urgency to we don't know what this is. We need to try to fix this, or there's got to be a cure out there. And going all over the country for hospital appointments and visiting with various neuro-ophthalmologists and talking to people for endless hours on the phone, and it sort of put everyone else in the family in the background. And I think, you know, that could be tough for the siblings, and realizing that they're still part of this family system, maybe more important than they ever were in terms of providing support to their sibling and also getting support. And so the family factors seem to really increase levels of psychological well-being, more so than any other. And that was my final hypothesis. And so I just want to talk real quick about some limitations of my dissertation, which I think are really important things, which was that, you know, from a multicultural standpoint, my sample was not very diverse. And I think it's important to, you know, be more inclusive and try to find a more diverse sample and see what other families are going through, because there are differences in coping based on culture, socioeconomic status, different religions. This really didn't look at which religion do you identify as or how often do you go to church. And so things like that could be interesting, or how many siblings do you have, and combining that data to see how that impacted things. So really deepening the scope here, I think, would be important. As well, you know, another limitation was that one of the options on the survey was not biracial or multiracial. That could have eliminated some very important people from the study. So I want to make sure to include all groups moving forward. Something really important was that my research study was in English. So if someone does not speak English, they didn't participate. So their data was not included here. They also had to have internet access to complete the survey. I think that is really important. You know, we're all sitting here and we know what LHON is. We're pretty privileged. There's people in the world right now that are losing their vision in poor parts of the world that probably don't even know why. They still don't know. And so they don't know that they have LHON. They just think that this happened to them or that it's something within their family. And so they're not able to participate in studies like this because that knowledge base isn't already there like it is for those of us sitting here. And, you know, moving forward, you know, what's the point of all this really? Why is this relevant? What does it mean? You know, I think it means a lot. You know, one of this talks about the core components of Division 17. That's what I'm a part of within the American Psychological Association, which is a division of counseling psychology. And one of the initiatives in psychology over the last 5 or 6 years has really been this push for an integrative care model. How, as psychologists, do we integrate with other mental health professionals, vocational rehabilitation professionals, and medical professionals? And I think this is really important. And it reminds me of that first visit when I was diagnosed and I was told there's nothing you can do and you just have to leave the office, because that's sort of how we're left sometimes. We get the diagnosis, we finally figure out what it is, and it's like, then what? And so I think if there's more collaboration between mental health providers like myself and neuro-ophthalmologists that are diagnosing individuals with LHON, proper referrals can be made, whether it's for support groups, whether it's for pointing out that this community exists and that there's conferences occurring every year, getting more people in the know, making referrals to psychologists in the area. I think this is all really important because it provides sort of this connection. I also think it's really important, whether they like it or not, to educate some people about the language that we use and using more person-centered language. I cannot tell you guys in this room how many times I've gone to a doctor's appointment or a visit and I've heard LHON in room 3. And I will sit there waiting and thinking, that's who I am, I'm LHON. And you know, as a psychologist, that's mortifying. I cannot imagine the front desk calling me and saying, your bipolar client is in the waiting room. That's just, we'd never talk like that. It's just, it's horrible to even think of something like that, and it sort of puts on this label that really makes someone feel like that's all that they are. And what we've heard all day today at this conference is that that's a part of who we are, and it's something that we're dealing with, adjusting to, and struggling with, but we're all capable of so much, and we're all doing so much more with our lives, and some incredible, inspirational stuff that I've heard today. And so to hear someone say, you're LHON in room 3, that's just not who anyone in this room is. And so when I talked earlier about us needing to do better, that's what I meant. That we need to do better as professionals, medical professionals, mental health professionals, about using language that's inclusive, and recognizing that disability is important, and it's a diversity variable, and it is the largest minority group in the United States, and it needs to get more attention than it currently does. And that LHON needs some of that too. And so while this is just a small start, and some of these research studies are just the first, and they need to be expanded on, obviously, to find out if this data is legitimate or whether it needs to be continued and tested more, I think that's where future research can go. But I think it's really, really essential for all of us in here and for all of our psychological well-being that we find that out, and that we really advocate for ourselves. I'm an intern this year at the University of Notre Dame, and being in Indiana, there's not much public transportation. And I'll tell one quick story and then I'll be done. I called for a taxi in February. It's about 20 degrees below zero, and I'm calling for this cab at about 6 p.m., and they said it'll be about an hour. And so it's now 7:30, and the taxi has not arrived. And I said, well, it's been about another 30 minutes. I think I need to call. And so I call the cab company, and the owner says, I don't know what's going on. The guy was there, and he left. I got to call somebody else, and it'll be 15 minutes. And so now it's 8 o'clock. And I said, well, this time I'm not waiting another 30 minutes. It's already been an extra 15. And so the driver, the dispatcher says to me, I can't get any drivers to you. I don't know what to tell you. There's too many Africans and they don't know how to drive. They're too lazy. That's a conversation for another conference probably, but in terms of that comment, that shocked me, and he said, just call another cab company because none of these guys want to pick you up. So I call another cab company. It's now 8:30 p.m. when I'm trying to get out of work by 6. They pick me up. I get in the cab, and the driver says, where are you going? And I give him my address, and I said, you take credit cards, right? And he says, absolutely not. If I knew that, I never would have picked you up. And I said, well, we can stop at an ATM and I'll just take the money out. And he says, that's fine. All of a sudden, we're pulling up to my apartment complex. And I said, don't we have to go to the gas station to go to the ATM? And he says, just get out. He says, just get out. And he says, never play me again. And I said, I'm not playing you. I absolutely would have paid you, and we can go right now. And he said, just get out. And so he doesn't even drop me off in front of my apartment. He drops me off on this road, a main road. Knew about my vision and just didn't seem to care. And so this was a situation where it was time to call the next day and tell the cab company what happened. Because it's freezing, there's ice all over the ground, and that's a long walk when you're supposed to get dropped off right in front of your building. And so this is one small example of things that happen every day and all the time. And I'm sure many of you have stories like this one, maybe more than I do. And so I think this speaks again to that need to say, you know, people are very helpful, and it's fantastic that people are helpful. And we've seen through some of the results of the studies that people that are helpful really help us in terms of the way that we cope with things. But it's okay to advocate for yourself and say that people also need to do better. And I'll say, like, within my field, people need to do better. And so by having that advocacy and like that need to have social justice be a part of who we are, I think that really pulls for things to keep improving. And that excites me.
Phil.
You know, it brings to mind, thank you, Jonathan. I didn't mean to cut you off so abruptly just as a panel, so I thought I'd just jump in. Something really strikes me. I think, and for those of you who are affected yourselves or whose family members are affected, just living life is going to activate all of these assumptions that we see on the part of society in general about disability. You know, I'm thinking about the various assumptions there. In your case, that you couldn't afford to pay for the cab, right? Any number of things, that you weren't going to leave a good enough tip. And I teach a class at Kent State called Psychosocial Impact of Disability, and we talk about these things. And there's a number of myths and misconceptions that we hold about people with disabilities. And I was in a cab one time, I'll tell you that story, which activated a lot of these as well in a really different way from someone who would appear to have been friendly and well-meaning. And I actually think he was. So I responded in kind of in sort of a different way, but it gets at these same issues. But someone mentioned, we talk about disability, one is the myth of unemployability, that if you have a disability, it means you can't do something other people can do, right? Just as a literal term. And the idea is that you can't work and provide for yourself. So the myth of unemployment and poverty is really big. Jonathan mentioned, alluded to the myth of asexuality, that people with disabilities approach a romance and their interests in other people in romantic and sexual ways in different ways than other people do. Either they don't have those same desires, or they have more desire than other people, right? And what we know is that interest in romance and sexuality is normally distributed among people with disabilities. Some people are interested, some people aren't, and most people are somewhere in the middle. But there's nothing unique about disability that creates a change in that particular desire. Another is the myth of congregation, that people with disabilities all want to hang out with other people who have disabilities. That may be true. We connect with things, you know, with people with whom we have things in common, but that may not be necessarily someone's abiding interest. They may want to just keep doing the things that they were doing prior to onset of disability. So I was in Washington, D.C., and coincidentally, I was going to deliver a presentation at the National Press Club about some work we had done on workplace discrimination. Don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's a very kind of intimidating environment, oak paneled rooms, and all these reporters are there, and they videotape it, and they have questions. So it was one of these ones that was a real honor to be invited to do this, and kind of a stressful preparation is going on. So I'm in the cab on my way to the National Press Club. And I told the driver, I said, I have a visual impairment, so I need you to drop me off right at the door when we get there. No problem. So he starts talking, and he says, what brings you into Washington, D.C.? And I said, I didn't have time to get into it. I was trying to think of my opening remarks and memorizing my PowerPoint and all of this kind of stuff. And so I just said, I'm here for work. I'm coming here for work. I wasn't trying to be unfriendly, but that was the truth. I was there for work. And he almost stopped the car. He turns around, and he said, you have a job? That's great, you know. And I looked about like I did now. I think I might have had a tie on or something, you know. I mean, I didn't think it'd be too unusual that I might be gainfully employed. And I said, yeah, and he asked me what I did, and I told him, and I'm still trying to go through my preparation. Then I realized that I had to call my wife and tell her that so there's the myth of unemployment, right? He assumes I wouldn't be having a job after I told him I'm legally blind. As to the myth of asexuality, I'm calling my wife and checking in and seeing what's happening, and you heard from the kids or whatever. I hang up the phone, arrange to, for my ride back at the airport the next day or whatever. The guy stops, turns around, you guessed it, he goes, you're married? Right? And again, I don't know, I was probably 35 years old, and it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect that someone might be married. I promise you he wouldn't have asked that question if he didn't know that I had a disability. What do you think, John, right? I mean, you don't ask somebody that in that way incredulously. So I said, yes, in fact, I am. He said, and you have children? And I said, yes, I have 3 children, Turns around one last time and he says, is your wife blind too? And I said, no, she's not blind, but she did pick out this tie, and the guy was literally trying to be friendly. He was trying to engage with me, and on some level, I thought maybe I ought to appreciate him because he wasn't being rude. I didn't even want to get in. I just wanted to get to my meeting, But it did strike me as I got thinking about it. The next evening, I came back to Kent and I taught this class, and we were talking about myths and misconceptions of disability. That was the lecture, and I realized that I'd been subject to 3 major ones all in one kind of conversation. So you guys don't want to hear our stories about how we get around and things like that, but these sorts of things do happen. And it isn't just from people who are trying to be mean or trying to be ignorant. We're activating the biases that people hold about disability because the specter of disability, Jonathan mentioned this whole notion of being temporarily able-bodied. 85% of Americans living in 2014 either have a disability currently or will have one by the definition of the Americans with Disabilities Act at some point in their lives. People are living longer than ever before. They're sustaining age-related disabilities, and 85% of all Americans are going to have personal experience with disability at some point in their lives. So this is a normal and naturally occurring part of the human experience in many ways, but it really kind of, it freaks people out, partly because it activates their own sense of mortality, of normalcy, of ability, of their own functioning. Because and if you think about it, if you will allow that a person with a disability can be leading a perfectly normal life, what does that say about you if you don't have a disability? It means you could have a disability too. It means maybe they're not so different from you, and you have to kind of change your view of how you look at issues of difference and things of that nature. And so it's not that people are necessarily trying to be cynical or trying to be mean. This is really kind of a natural part of the process as we look at and consider people who are different from us. Many of these same outgroup social psychology issues apply when we look at people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Or I'm from the Cleveland area, how we look at people from Pittsburgh, right? I mean, this is really, and vice versa, right? Really, really different in these things. So I guess rather than trying to avoid them and prevent them, knowing how to respond to them when they do happen, and if you care to, and you want to make a point, you want to educate somebody, that's fine. But sometimes we just feel like getting to our apartment. Sometimes you just feel like getting to your meeting. You know what I mean? You don't want to, I'm like Charles Barkley. I'm not a role model. You know, I just want to go to work. And so those things I think are really, really strike me in your story and the things that you found. The other thing is this issue of resilience. It kept popping into my head as Jonathan was going through his study. And resilience, whether that's the individual, it's how well you deal with stuff, right? That is most people believe that's a generalized concept. Think of it in your own lives, at the individual level and within families. In other words, people who deal well with stuff that happens to them tend to deal well with all stuff that happens to them, okay? There's nothing unique about disability or the onset of Leber's, although it is a major stressor and can be profoundly life-altering, but no more so than other major stressors that we deal with. And what we find over and over, and if you want to predict how well someone will adjust to disability, or in Leber's in particular, the best indicator of that is how well did they adjust to things prior to onset. Now, when you're dealing with people who are still developing, right, late teens, early 20s, that kind of stuff, it's not quite as strong a predictor, but generally how well you deal with things overall is going to determine what kind of resources you have to deal with any kind of stress or even disability. The same is true in your families. If your families, and I think it's really important to critically evaluate at this time when you're dealing with Leber's, whether that's with the person who's affected or the whole family system, as Jonathan so aptly pointed out, be willing to objectively and critically evaluate how well do we deal with stuff in our family, you know, because that's going to set your current ability to deal with LHON and its impact. So if your family is one that rallies around one another, you communicate effectively, you support one another, etc., you're going to keep doing that even with the onset of LHON. If your family doesn't have those skills or those qualities, it's very important to realize that this particular stressor could be one unlike any that you've ever dealt with, and asking for help, seeking marriage and family counseling if that's the issue, individual adjustment counseling for the person who's affected, helping them move forward with the next step in their careers, all of that kind of stuff. But doing an assessment really on how well prepared is your family, and no one's family is totally prepared. But you know, and you guys probably know this. Don't you just know people who just deal with stuff? And don't you know families that seem to kind of roll with it? Mine wasn't one of those, for sure. We figured some things out, but we were no better at dealing with my visual loss than we were in dealing with anything, than anything else. And we had to really develop those kinds of those skills. There was a lot of support, but the ability to solve problems wasn't there in the family that I grew up in, and we had to kind of learn as we went. And I think it's really important to critically evaluate where you guys are all at as far as that goes and what the needs are. But that issue of resilience, that's the antidote to this. It's how well do you deal with things, how well do you move forward, how well do you manage the extent to which this intrudes upon your life, the person who's affected, and the entire system.
In our prep for this, we talked about how do you remain useful? Useful in relationships that you had established before. How do they regenerate into a new form? And I'd like both of our panelists to talk about usefulness and as part of the process, next phase of going forward.
Yeah, I think what was difficult for me when this first happened was I said, I don't want to meet anyone new because everyone who knows me knew me before. And so they kind of remember how I was before it. And I think that was tough for me in the first few months, was not wanting to meet new people because the people that I knew already sort of remembered me for how I was. And I was holding on to that for a little bit too long. And so after the onset of LHON, this idea of usefulness in relationships is realizing that there's a lot to give that doesn't necessarily have to do with the body. I think in terms of giving support to a romantic partner or to your family or providing empathy to someone else's struggles, those are things that have been core values of who I am as a person, and I think those are things I'm still capable of giving and doing regardless of my vision. And is that sort of there always? It is, in terms of your vision loss always being, it's always a part of your relationship and how you navigate things with your significant other or how you maybe navigate things with your friends. But It just means doing things differently, not necessarily having to stop doing them. And I think that's what I learned most through this process so far, and continue to learn as it continues to evolve.
I want to just underscore one thing he said. He said doing things differently, but not necessarily stopping doing them. Remember what I said, don't stop. What I had said before is that disability of any kind doesn't affect people's interests, it doesn't affect their values, it doesn't affect their passions and the things that they really like to do, it doesn't affect who they are at core levels, it affects their abilities to do all kinds of things, and that's the difficulty. But for most people who acquire a disability of any kind, what they want to do is, as you were saying, you want to keep things going as much as you possibly can. And that's not denial, because you're going to be going about it in a really very, very different way. It's about managing that intrusion factor. How much are you going to let this literally pull the rug out from under you? And finding ways, I think this is a challenge for the families, finding ways to help your loved one who's affected continue doing those things that he or she likes most, that he or she is most passionate about. And sometimes that means getting up in the middle of the night and bringing them to a dance or whatever it might be, where they can't drive anymore, or any of those kinds of things. That, I think, is very, very important, is continuing to do those things. What is it that you really like to do? What are you passionate about? And you may find other interests as you move forward, but finding ways to doing the same things in a different way. That's what most people want. Most people aren't bargaining for a major life change. It's bad enough that you're changing the way that you deal with the visual world. You may not want to change all those other aspects of your life. Moving forward with education, keeping on your current job through accommodations that are available to you in the workplace, and that whole idea of feeling like you're holding up your end of the bargain in relationships. It really does change the way that relationships work. We become dependent on people in ways that we weren't before, but that doesn't mean that the whole relationship has to be one of dependency. You find other ways to contribute. My wife reads and pre-screens the mail because it doesn't take her as long as it does for me to read it on my CCTV. She does the checkbook. I'm in charge of long-term financial investments, those kinds of things. I've figured out a few ways to cook dinner. My schedule's more flexible. I get home before she does. I can cook a few meals without burning myself too badly, and I cook the meals. I've gotten out of doing dishes because she thinks I can't see well enough, and I just leave a couple dirty ones in the sink, and she doesn't ask me anymore. Mowing the lawn's another thing. I'm out of that altogether. We call those secondary gains, right, Jonathan? So you find ways to make contributions and feel useful and feel productive and those kinds of things, and everybody has a different view of how this condition or any other is, how much that kind of centers their whole lives. For many people, the issue of disability is very central to their identity and their very sense of being. Nothing wrong with that if you integrate that into who you are and you make your responses, accordingly. Other people will tell you, this is just something I have to deal with, and I figure out ways of doing that. And there's all sorts of responses in between. So maybe an assessment in your own family of how central the LHON is to your overall mode of operating. Do you make it is it the thing that drives everything you do, all the decisions that you make? If so, then you got to look at the role that everybody plays in that. Is everybody on board with it? If it really is incidental and it's just one of those things that we have to deal with, is it so incidental that it doesn't get enough attention? Or is that how it works best for the person who's affected and for the whole system? So this issue of, I think, resilience and staying, I think, the best way to stay useful is to stay busy, I think, as much as whatever that is, whatever your loved one or you are throwing yourselves into, keep doing that just as much as you did before, because that's going to move you forward in ways, and continuing to do the things you like to do, maybe in different ways. I'm really glad you mentioned that.
One final question, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Using the corollary to the Jerry Maguire, help me, help you, in those situations with family members where you have people in denial, how can we help them help us? How can we help them adapt? Because you're probably adapting faster because you have to, and that leaves people behind. So how do we do that? Any recommendations you can make for us?
Okay. This guy wants the last word. That's what it is. Yeah, I know that already. One of the things that strikes me is it's really important, and this is putting a lot of onus on the person who is affected, but it might apply I think it applies to everybody involved. I think the issue of honest and open communication is really more important when you're dealing with an issue like this than it would be if you weren't. And people being straightforward, people being honest, people being transparent, and sometimes that's really difficult. So if you're the one who's affected and you feel like staying in your room today because you just feel like crap because you can't drive anymore or you can't read, just say so. Be straight. These are the people who care about you more than anybody, and lay it out there and let them. They may not have the skills to help you. You may not want help, but just process that. Be honest about your feelings, and I think that's a very difficult thing for many families to do, but it comes up because a condition like this does evoke more feelings of adjustment and questioning about what's going to happen next. And so I think families, the family meeting, I think, helps in regard to all of those kinds of things, and that whole issue of the person who's affected taking, consuming so much of the energy, parental energy from the siblings, of the family in general, that becomes an issue as well. So I would say, be honest, be direct for the families to the affected person, be sensitive about the experience that person is having, as I know you are sometimes, and sometimes asking them, is this why you're choosing not to go to this particular thing, the family reunion that you used to go, because you don't want people asking how your vision's doing? Is that why? And if so, say so, and let's deal with that. So I think developing those kinds of skills are very, very important. It's also really difficult to tell people what your needs are if you don't know what they are yourself. And I think finding ways to help to figure out. I'm big on technology assessments, independent living assessments, vocational assessments. Go and find out what's left there, not just the medical stuff, but find out what technologies you can use to stay connected with the world in various ways, and to communicate with, you know how people communicate nowadays. We don't talk on the phone. We sit across from each other with laptops and Facebook each other or something, So figure out a way to do that and stay connected. I think that's really important particularly for younger people who are dealing with this. But I think honesty, open communication, counseling and therapy if you need it, those are some of the things that I would suggest. And opening that line of communication, maybe even to a greater extent than it was before the onset of Liebers. You're up, my friend.
Okay. I think in any relationship that I've ever been in, family and non-family, I've sort of struggled with the idea of, am I asking for too much here, or am I not asking for enough? And so navigating that was always very difficult. And it's tough when you're affected and you're losing your vision, but then everyone else is reacting in a different way. So there's some people in the family that are saying, you can do anything, you're fine. And then there's some people that are devastated and in tears themselves. And it's all supportive, but in a different way. And for me, my parents were incredibly supportive. My partner was incredibly supportive. And so for that reason, that helped me deal with it. But I think everyone handled it differently. And I think that was actually good for me, was that someone was upset, and I knew I could go to them when I was upset because they sort of shared that experience with me. Or I love my father to death, but when I was living in Boston, he would sort of grab my arm every time we crossed the street. And I said, Dad, how do you think I'm doing this when you're not here? And so sometimes being honest and saying, I could do it.
My grandmother died 3 years ago. I was 42 years old. She started cutting my meat for me at dinner when this happened, when I was 15, and she never stopped, Yeah. And I'm pretty good with a knife. Yeah.
Or I have some friends who are a mile ahead of me walking down the street. I'm like, I kind of do need you to slow down. So it's being able to to be that, again, have that open communication and have your needs met, whether it's to have someone decrease what they're doing or maybe asking someone to do a little bit more with you. I think as someone that's affected, that's really important.
Okay. We'd like to open it to any questions you might have for our panel. We have right here.
I have a question that I think would be helpful.
We have a mic coming your way.
I think it'll be helpful to young ones who are just starting off with this issue, affected. My son is too. How did you navigate through the education? What tools were made available to you? What they should be looking for in selecting where they should go for pursuing their education? I know there are some in this room who are quite young and they've just been affected with it recently. My son finished school before he was affected, so that's easy for him. But I think it really helped with two of you accomplishing what you accomplished academically would help them as to what to look for and what aids are available for them, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said it was good that one of your kids finished school first. And, you know, my parents always wanted me to be a dentist. I think they thought it would be lucrative, and I think if I would have finished school first and been a dentist, nobody wants my fingers in their mouth right now. And so I actually consider it to be an advantage that this happened, and at the time I didn't think so. When I was 20 and a sophomore in college, I did not think it was a good thing. But looking back on it now, it was sort of advantageous because I sort of could pick a career that I could do based on having this particular disability. So realizing that with low vision, there were certain careers that probably weren't going to be possible, such as being a dentist. But there were careers like being a psychologist that were very possible. And so for me, it was I sort of had an opposite experience where, you know, I was 20 years old, not really interested in going to school, not really doing well academically, and then this happened and it sort of triggered, okay, you now have a serious issue to deal with. You better figure out what you want to do. There's no more playing around or skipping classes or going out with your friends. You now need to figure it out because it's going to be harder for you. And so for me, it sort of had an opposite effect where I now needed to figure things out. And so, and it happened to me during college, and college is a little bit different to navigate than school because it's more individualized, it's more an independent process. You go through the disability office on campus. Most of them are not very great. I know at Notre Dame we have one staff member for 12,000 students. And that's, I mean, it's horrible. And so there's a lot of advocacy, a lot of frustration, but I think it's a matter of sticking through it and also talking to other people that have been through it really helps motivate you. Because I think that helped me at the time, was talking to other people that had various disabilities but were still thriving academically during times when I didn't think it would be possible.
Great, that's great. I think just to add to that a little bit, I think one of the advantages that people with LHON have over people with other certain other disabilities is that you know, it doesn't affect your intellectual ability, or it didn't mine. I mean, I wasn't very smart to begin with, you know, so it didn't matter much really at all. So I think the real problem then that students with visual impairments have in high school or college is access to information. That's really what it's all about. And my advice would be to load up, whether your kid likes it or not, or kids, if you're here and getting ready for college or high school, you may not like it, load up on technology skills. You're going to have to deal with computing, with the internet, with Microsoft Word. You're going to have to get that information one way or the other. Smartphones will talk to you now and all kinds. This is way over my head, but I'm too old to learn all those new things. But going through and getting technology, so you learn to type, you learn brailing if that's an issue for you, learn voice output, large print, whatever you've got, and utilize every single ounce of residual capacity that you have. While you're waiting for the cure, while you're doing the fundraisers, all of those kinds of things, it's really a, you know, hope for the best and be prepared for the worst. And I think it's through technology and that's what really equalizes the educational experience for people. As a guy who never left school, I'm still in school. If I can get something into my computer system or it's on the internet, I can deal with it, I can interact with it, and I'm not limited in that way. I don't have any disadvantages whatsoever in typing or in reviewing materials, my students' papers. It's all done electronically. The last 3 books that I've written were never even printed in hard copy until the book actually came out, you know, in print. And so it's all done electronically now. And by really arming oneself with all of those skills, the disadvantages are really minimal in terms of your ability to interact with information. That doesn't solve the transportation problem and some of these other issues that we've been talking about, but the accommodations that you use in the college classroom also articulate to the accommodations that you're going to use in the world of work, depending on your major. And so it's a great way to practice using those technologies that you're going to have to use in the workplace as well. I really think access to information through technology is probably the main key to it, because if we provide people with full access to that information, then it's just their hard work and their intellectual abilities that'll carry them forward.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we got
Some more?
I just want to bring up the point about the counseling and the therapy, going to therapy is important too for the mothers and siblings as well, because some of the counselors, they don't know exactly what to say to you. They'll tell you no cure, no treatment. So, you know, they just expect for you. But as a mother, when you hear that, it's real sad and it's devastating. So you feel like you got to do something, you know, you got to do something to help your child. But when you hear no cure, no treatment, just go home and that's it. So then, you know, as a parent, you need to have some counseling as well. You need some therapy too. So, but the counselors, they just don't know what to say to you and they just don't know what to do. So sometimes they can be a little bit more sensitive too. You know, just say the right words to you to make you feel better so you can get in and do something to help, like joining these groups and things like this.
Absolutely. We can't make it mandatory as a response to LHON. I don't know that I would. Not everybody needs it, but I'll tell you what, it doesn't hurt anybody. You know, it cannot hurt, and it can only help going and seeking that kind of help. And what is counseling for? It's to help you solve the problems that are too big for you to figure out on your own. There's no shame in that. We all have these kinds of things happening to us, and go and get that help. Your families are going to be stronger for it. You're going to be stronger. You're going to be more effective as a parent, as a spouse, as a partner in every way. It's not required, but I'd like to put it on the syllabus if I could.
Well, and I would say too, face validity goes a long way, and the research has shown that the relationship in the room in counseling is really the most effective way to have someone get treated for whatever they're coming in with. And so face validity goes a long way. Some people that are from a certain racial or ethnic background would prefer a therapist from that same background. And so when it comes to disability, it might be harder to find a therapist that's visually impaired or that has LHON, but finding a therapist that maybe has had disability research in their background or has a disability themselves, I think that relational piece is really important. And so seeking that out could be crucial too.
And I just wanted to point out that that what Liz has put together and the Facebook page and LHON are invaluable resources. I know just in the past month or two, someone put a question out there about technology, especially, you know, and I said, I'm sure my son Mark can help you. And Mark was an invaluable resource to this person because that's what his expertise is, technology. JAWS, Zoom text, loading it, problems with it, having worked with it. So reach out and ask. And when Mark first lost his eyesight, he went to Arkansas. Lions World had a school there. It ended up not working out for him because he knew more than the person teaching the computer class because it was new to the school. But they did do all the assistive things. Our state had a program. He spent 2 weeks there learning cooking skills, those kind of things. I don't know. Yeah, the technology center. So we went to the National Federation for the Blind in Baltimore to see what all the assistive technology devices they had. We looked at all of them. He went to a JAWS class. And finding the right counselor, that was hit or miss. We had one not so good, then we had another one who made, you know, he got a CCTV in our home. There were so many things that were made available. Certainly, I spent a lot of time on the internet, made a lot of phone calls, found out what was out there, and there were some that were hits, some that were misses. But the more you reach out, the more you make phone calls, and especially if Lissa doesn't have the information, she may suggest someone that does. I just saw a post from her that I had probably a year ago asking me to contact somebody that I didn't. I was like, oh, darn, I didn't follow through. So they may not all follow through right away, but I think having this community is a great place, especially if you know someone in your state who's gone through it before and they can tell you the resources. So as you go through this, keep a notebook. Document it in your computer. Because someone may be calling you saying, who did you contact for this? Who did you find helpful for that? So if we all keep a list of what we've gone through, it'll be invaluable as we have this ability to connect with one another. So thank you again, gentlemen, for your successes that you've shared with us.
Thank you. And if Mark hires out, I might be in a position to make it worth his while to help me figure out how to get the voicemail out of my new cell phone. So keep that in mind. Thank you. One of the things that strikes me is, what's a better resource than people who are going through the same thing you're going through at the same time? I mean, come on, this is where it ought to begin. And thanks to Lissa and to all of you for everything that you do to bring this. I didn't even know this group existed until 4 months ago, and I've been working in the field for 25 years. So thanks to all of you, and again, the last word is yours, Jonathan.
Okay. No, not much to say on that, just that I agree. I think it's so therapeutic to have this community and to have that relation piece where everyone's forming relationships here this weekend, and it's really important. And so it's great to see that.
Enough said. Thank you very much. Let's thank our panel.